So awesome. We are actually being live streamed on YouTube. Excellent, excellent. So welcome everyone to this live presentation on integrative systemic therapy. And so I have added this to the 4th edition of Mastering Competencies in Family Therapy. And at the moment it is in the integrative chapter, because the title makes sense. But boy, I was really tempted of having this actually in the systems chapter, because if you're listening and you've really struggled with trying to understand traditional systemic therapy like Václavic and the MRI group, Jay Haley's work in strategic therapy, or the Milan team, they are by far, I think, hands down, the hardest theory for folks to learn. And so I think you're going to find this truly a gift. And I'm going to be updating my counseling theory textbooks next. And I think IST is definitely going to be very much appreciated and very central in the next edition of my counseling text, because IST takes systemic therapy theories, which are some of the most complex in the whole field, and just makes it really, I think, user-friendly for the 21st century. So I'm a total fan of user-friendly, as if you know any of my work, you probably know that. So it's like, oh, this makes sense. Yeah, because, you know, the foundations of systemic therapies come from cybernetics, and it's actually an interdisciplinary field with some really heavy vocab and concepts that actually come out of, engineering. I mean, the same concepts that are used to create, self-guided missiles and understand ecosystems is the foundation of systems theories. And so there's just some complex vocabulary and languaging of things that, especially I have found. I'm teaching these ideas for over 30 years, and I can tell you each decade, like, students struggle more and more and more. And so I think, especially if you're newer to the field of counseling, family therapy, psychotherapy in general, this is going to be like, oh, thank God, it finally makes sense. Okay. So with all of that intro, we're going to go ahead and get started here. And as I'm talking, if you have questions, just go ahead and put them into the Q&A section, and I will answer those at the end. You can chat with each other in the chat. In fact, for those of you who are here with me live, go ahead and put into the chat, like, what have you struggled most with systems theories? Does anything I'm saying resonate with you? Anyone struggling with systems theories? It's like, oh my God, how does it make sense? So go ahead and let me know, and I will kind of circle back to all of your comments after I introduce you to this totally user-friendly approach. So let's get started. So what is IST? So two different researchers kind of came together. Doug Brulin and Bill Pinsoff came together at the Family Institute of Northwestern. They had been working with system ideas for several decades themselves. They came together and created this integrative systemic therapy from both of their prior independent work. And it really pulls together all the foundations of cybernetics with the classic applications of systems theories. And there was a point as I've been writing these textbooks, I'm like, if someone doesn't do an integrated systems theory that just makes the vocabulary very, very simple, I'm going to have to do it myself. So I love what they've done. I think it's brilliant, and thank God they did it, because it's a lot of work too. So this was just so needed, and it's nice when you're like, God, someone's got to do this. I'm like, oh, someone did do this. This is awesome. And we're going to go through. There are these conceptual pillars that are very classic, have classic systemic therapy roots, but it's phrased in a way that's much easier to understand. So when I have doctoral students trying to teach them and read through like pragmatics of human communication, like kind of where we off the field started, it's not an easy thing even at the doctoral level. So it's nice to have these concepts spelled out in a simple way. And then it has a very classic systemic intervention format, where you define the problem, you look at the behaviors related to it, specifically the sequence of behaviors around it. And then you look at a way to interrupt that and implement a new sequence of behaviors that has a solution in it. So it simplifies. I know systems theory is very counterintuitive in a lot of ways. So that's why a lot of people struggle with it. And so this approach really streamlines all of that. Oh, yeah, you just keep repeating. I'm going to show you how you repeat, you keep tweaking, identify the problem, attempt a solution, see what happens, and then adjust, your next tweak to this solution. And you just keep tweaking and tweaking until the problem is fully resolved. And it describes a lot of therapy, I think. So let's go through the conceptual pillars. There are actually 5 of them. And the first conceptual pillar is the epistemological pillar, and it acknowledges that there is an objective layer of reality at the behavioral level. We can, usually see the same behaviors happening. However, all of these behaviors are experienced through a subjective lens. And so even how you language what you just saw reveals some of your subjective reality. And so, yes, there is objectivity here. There's been quite a debate between the traditional systems and postmodern about reality. And they're like, yes, there is a reality, but all of this behavioral, physical reality is filtered through all of our lenses, and even our descriptions have remnants of our subjective perspective when we speak. So that's epistemology. Epistemology is how do you know what you know? And so we see everything out there, but it is all through our own subjective lenses. The ontological pillar is about just the nature of the reality, the nature of the existence in the universe. So the ontological assumptions of this approach, really, this is where they summarize a lot of the core cybernetic general systems principles in just very simple language, using as little cybernetic jargon, which I know trips up a lot of people. So this should sound familiar if you've read any systemic chapter during your training as a psychotherapist. So the first assumption is here that systems are organized. There is an organizational structure to all social systems, and that we are all part of multiple systems, our partner, our family of origin, our family of procreation, our schools and university systems, our workplace systems, our local community, religion, religious organizations, our government is a system, right? So we're nested, and we're a part of many different systems, or part of multiple systems. And for all of these systems, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And I think everyone's probably heard that. And what that means, though, and I think understanding that and living that and knowing how that affects intervention is a whole different thing than kind of going, yeah, that makes sense. So what this is talking about here is how, let's use a family as an example. And when you have a family, right, it's not just 4 different individual psychologies. I'm picking on family of 4, right? 4 individual psychologies, let's say, in the classic American family. What is it? 2.2 children or whatever. I think it's below that now. Because there's the whole of that family has processes, it has structure, organization, and that is bigger than any one individual alone can influence or control or create. This whole system is bigger than just adding up all the individual psychologies together. And so from a systemic perspective, you're always intervening on this whole system that has these kind of these subsystems, which are the individuals. And all, for the family, for example, you'll have a couple and often a parental subsystem, right? So even in the simplest, family of 4, there are a lot of different wholes that are functioning there as well. But the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts, and that this relationship entity is bigger than just the members of it. So another important ontological assumption is that every behaviors can only be understood correctly in context. And when you take any behavior and try to interpret it out of context, you don't know what it means. And you can't properly understand that. So that means even just a given symptom you don't know exactly what it means unless you understand the full context of it all. For example, I've been doing a lot of DSM-5 training, so this is the first example that comes to me. In the particular village where my family comes from in Greece, there is a 3-year mourning period where you would wear black, and that is appropriate, right? And that is normal and standard. Well, if you're going to go diagnose prolonged grief disorder, if you saw someone from traditional, you part your hair a certain way, there are all these rituals around it all. If you saw someone from the traditional village where my grandmother came from, you would probably think they have prolonged grief disorder because, wow, it's 3 years later, she's not moving on, she's got her hair, parted this way, she's still wearing black, this is really weird. But in that cultural context, that's normal, that's prescribed, that's what you're supposed to do. And so, what would be symptomatic in one culture isn't necessarily symptomatic in another culture. And you need to know. And it's very possible, and I suspect that in Athens, even within the same culture, drive 100 miles to Athens, and all of a sudden that's not the ritual. So I got my version of culture that I got from tiny little semi-migrant goat herding community. So what I've learned to be Greek culture, I don't think is probably anything like, and the exact same time period of what was going on in Athens. So even within the same culture, you cannot interpret just by looking at a behavior and determining whether or not it's true or not. Like I learned if you stepped over a broom handle, you're kind of damning your mother to die. So we don't step over brooms. Like, does everyone in Greece believe that? I have no idea, but that's what they believe in my little village. And that's what my family taught me. And so that's what I grew up with. So, so all that to say is any behavior, and oftentimes how many of us have seen our partner, our children, our friend, a stranger on the street, and we look at their behavior and we judge it and we make a judgment, and without having the full context or the full story. And from a systemic perspective, that is a very, very dangerous thing to do. And you're going to probably not be correct. So you have to understand the context before you can interpret what it means. The next concept here is all behavior has consequences on the system, but only certain behaviors really serve systemic functions. So no matter what the members might be doing, right, it's going to have an effect on people, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily key to maintaining the homeostasis or creating an escalation in the system. So not all of it necessarily is maintaining the homeostasis of the family. The next principle here is that feedback regulates relationships. So that is, we're always constantly, person A is affecting person B, which affects person A, and we keep reinforcing each other's behaviors. And it regulates, and creates this homeostasis, which is what we consider normal in a given relationship. And then the last one is, and this has been said so many ways in the field, but forces within systems move both towards change and towards stasis. And I know one of the things I remember when first learning systems, that some of the systemic founders would always say there's always a part of the family that wants change and there's another part that doesn't. So there's these counterbalancing forces, and you have to learn how to work with that tension that we all have. Like, we want to change, but boy, you give us the tools to change, and most of the time, as you probably know, your clients don't change or you don't change, right? You can look at just New Year's resolutions. Many of us, kind of want to change, but it's really hard for humans to truly make a change that is shifts our homeostasis, our norms, and shifts our behavior long term. So there's always this part that's wanting change and a part that's not wanting change. And you need to align and understand how to work with both sides of that very human psychology, tendency, whatever you want to call it. But we have both forces within us, and it's okay. And just labeling a client resistant is usually not the most useful thing to help them achieve change, because within us is always a force that is resisting change, and even when you're asking for it. And welcome to humanity. We are a riddle of contradictions. So continuing on with the 5 pillars, the third pillar is the sequence pillar. And so this is the hallmark of all systems approaches. And before I had IST, I always said the main difference when you're trying, my students often get very confused between systemic family therapies and structural. And I'm like, systemic theories are always tracking that interaction pattern, that sequence of behaviors. That is what they're looking at. Structural family therapy, it's more like they take a snapshot or an X-ray of the system and are focusing on the structure. More like it's a still picture. And with systems, it's always moving around that interaction sequence. And so they're always focusing on these behavioral sequences or cycles and the meanings and emotions that relate to them. And that is what's targeted for change, is the interaction cycle is always what is targeted for change. And the constraint pillar is that this concept that there are always outside of us a web of constraints, in various ways. It can be biological within us, it can be societal with outside of us, and everything in between. But we'll talk about those in more detail, that limit positive change, what you can and cannot do. It can be financial resources, it can be your physiological health. It can be societal processes, right? Governments and what's going on in society. So that's the constraints. And then finally, we have what they call the causality pillar. So within the field of family therapy, certainly in the earlier family therapies, you'll hear them talk a lot about this distinction between linear and circular causality. And so linear causality is very much embedded in cognitive behavioral approaches, A caused B, and that resulted in C. And so, if you think of ABC theory for Albert Ellis, there's the activating event, there was an emotion, and that there was a belief that caused the consequence or emotion, right? Or behavior, or whatever the consequence is. But it's very linear. So cognitive behavioral therapies analyze things in a linear way, where in systems, it's always looking at things circular, and how A affects B and B affects A and A affects B. And then you can add C, D, E, F, and G in there. And we get a lot of circles and loops and interactions and multiple two-way interactions going on. And so in IST, what they're saying is, that causality is, generally circular. There's a circle to it, but it doesn't mean that there's an equal influence in the sense that some people contribute differently to the maintenance of the problem. So for example, if you have a very angry parent who does a lot of yelling and you have a young child, let's say, that parent is doing more to influence that circle and that, loop of causality than the child is. So there can be power differentials in particular, where we see there's not an equal influence to what is going on. But how the child responds to the parent still affects the exact cycle and how the yelling happens. Is the child deferential? Do they cry? Are they defiant? What happens? So you want to analyze that cycle, but it doesn't mean there's always equal blame, because there can be differentials in powers and ability to influence that cycle. Okay. So in terms of the big picture of IST, so when you begin therapy using an IST or any systemic approach, the first thing they're going to do is define what the problem is. And they're going to do that by engaging, with direct engagement of the client. So the therapist isn't sitting there in the back room and diagnosing and coming up with a conceptualization and defining the problem without the client. It is very much a two-way engagement of this is the issue. Now, if you worked with couples or families before, getting even 2 to 4 people on the same page as to what the problem is can be tricky. But thanks to circular causality, I promise you, though, even if you can't get every client in the room, if you've got a multi-person client, to agree on the problem, if you take, person A and person B's definition of the problem, they're usually complementary. They usually fit together, and I can usually come up with a way of describing. So when this happens, this happens, and, for this person and that person, and I just kind of string it together, and usually you're fine. But yes, you can come up with, I have definitely worked with clients where we they're still here with the problem, and you end up just putting those two pieces together to see how they are interconnected, and part of oftentimes the opposite sides of the same thing. Then you're going to identify the problem sequence. And for this, you're always going to start with, when is the problem? Start before there is the symptom. You'll see the rise in tension, the symptom at its worst, and then how things kind of go back to normal. So those of you who are familiar with my unifying framework, my therapy that works unifying framework, this should sound really familiar, because that is the classic systemic thing. You go from a no symptom or low symptom. Like with depression, you have usually just fewer depressed symptoms or more depressed symptoms. With panic, you can go from no panic to full-blown panic, but you always want to track from when the symptom is at its least, how it rises, what is the symptom like at its worst, and what is everyone doing around that symptom when it's at its worst, whether it's intrapsychic or interpersonal. And then how do things slowly get back to normal? And usually that how do things get back to normal gives you a lot of clues as to what to do or not do to change the cycle. But you're always, that's the problem sequence. And you can homeostasis, rise of tension, symptom at its worst, back to normal. And then you identify a solution sequence to replace all or part of that problem sequence. So typically in this approach, you are focusing on tracking that behavioral piece. I guess, since I know many of my students are going to be listening to this, in the therapy that works unifying framework approach, I actually track it behaviorally, emotionally, cognitively, and with the social location discourses, social dominant discourses at the top here. So, but this sequence there's a lot of focus on the problem, but of course you'll be talking about cognitions and emotions along the way as well. But then you want to find, how do we look at what that sequence is, and where in that cycle can we insert a new sequence that would be better? And usually that's going to be changing something that happens in the tension phase, right? In the tension building phase, when it could lead to the symptom, and instead we want the alternative to the symptom. So you're going to identify something that you can put in there that would be different. So what this might look like, I'm just trying to think. Well, a common one with couples or families, if they're escalating, right, in terms of an argument, you take a structured timeout, which is, the person who feels escalated, they say, hey, let's take a break. We'll meet in an hour to reconvene and continue. So that is a solution sequence. You're saying a structured timeout is an option for what to do with a couple who escalates by arguing. So you can, and you can also do things that don't make logical sense here. And this is where we're going back into some of the more traditional stuff. You can have them write things down, or you can have them, some of the classic interventions in family therapy would, have them do symbolic gestures like set up a courtroom to just shift the context. So you can have the symptom, but it has to change the context so it changes its meaning. But anyway, you're going to tweak that, and it can be very direct, like a structured timeout, which is I consider that a logical, or you can have them that are more paradoxical or non sequitur almost, to just shift the context. Normally you start out with what's called, I guess Jay Haley called these direct directives, which these are logical things to be doing. You normally start there, and if those keep backfiring, then you would move on to more paradoxical things. And then you're going to look at some of the constraints. I call this troubleshooting before I send my clients home, but anything that might prohibit the implementation of a solution sequence. So what are some of the things that might make it hard for this to happen, the solution to be enacted? And then if, basically you want to get to a place where you have them be in a similar situation that used to cause a problem, but this time they have solution behaviors and they're able to maintain that. So every time, I don't know, they disagree about parenting, instead of getting into an argument where they insult each other, they are able to talk through it in an effective way. So I know this looks a little bit daunting. So let me see. So you're going to start here at step 1 at the very top here. And that's where you are in the intake. You meet the system and you define the problem. Then step 2, you want to identify that problem sequence. And typically you're doing that as soon as the first session. Okay. And then for step 3, you're identifying a potential solution sequence. So you're working with your client collaboratively to identify what things could we do differently to solve this issue. And then you send them home and try, or either do it in a session or you send them home trying to implement it. And then when they come back, when they come back, you want to go evaluate what happened. Did it work? Did it not? Were they able to do it? Were they not able to do it? Was it helpful? Right? So if it was successful, they were able to implement it and it worked, then you have them do more of that, right? And so then you want to really move to step 5, implement and maintain the sequence. But if it didn't work or only partially worked, you're going to go back and say, so what were the constraints? What type of things made it difficult to implement? Then we're going to identify that, and then we are going to tweak our solution and then see how that works. And oftentimes you go round and round and you keep tweaking. So we'll try something different and go home, try that. Did that work or not? Get the feedback, then, see if what else we need to change. And once you figure out how to get a solution cycle going, then you just want to maintain it. So I think this seems pretty straightforward and logical in some ways. I think really describes therapy in a lot of different approaches. So in terms of the case conceptualization, the therapist is responsible for designing the treatment and the intervention. So the therapist takes on this, a responsibility for the process and making change happen. But it's obviously a continually evolving process. Where you're getting client impact, getting feedback, seeing what works, what doesn't, what the clients think about that, and then, add that into the solution, that's being discussed, and then keep, it's almost like a little bit of a research experiment. That's kind of how it feels like. So, and they actually refer to it as testing their hypotheses, assessing the outcomes, revising the hypotheses. And so, and this is just a repetitive process until the problem is no longer a problem. And this just comes straight out of the classic systemic approaches like MRI, and yet, and I think it's kind of hard to see often for a lot of folks when they're learning it, because it seems because the vocabulary is kind of heavy in traditional systemic approaches. So isn't this a beautiful, simple little diagram? You hypothesize, you make a plan, you converse about it, and then you get the feedback, and then you go back and hypothesize, and you have this little feedback loop that goes back and forth. You hypothesize what's going on, you make a plan, you get talk about it, get the feedback, and see how it works. And you just keep doing this loop until the problem is resolved. And let's get real. In the real world, normally then they present you. It's like once they learn, you can have a few clients. Oh, well, you solved this problem now. Now let's move on to that problem. Oh, and you just solved B. Let's go on to C. I have that. That is a very common thing that happens as well. So hypothesizing. So when hypothesizing, they're looking at what they call this web of human experience. And this is where meta frameworks, when I first came into the field, meta frameworks was this kind of a separate theory, and it's been integrated here. But this web of human experience is part of the hypothesizing process. So the first part of this is considering what they call organizational meta frameworks. So how the components of the system come together and function as a whole. So this can be looking at boundaries and subsystems. Is there enmeshment? Is there too much distance? Is there too much hierarchy? Not enough hierarchy? Is there respect? What's the organization of the system? And, does it make sense? And typically you're also asking yourself, does it developmentally make sense? Is it the right, amount of parental hierarchy for this stage of the child's development? The next one is just developmental frameworks. So these are hypotheses related to the individual, family, and relationship development. You can have a situation, this is a very common one, actually, especially if you start seeing a lot of 10, 11, 12-year-olds presenting for therapy. That is where parenting really shifts in those tween years. And as you become a teenager, there's very different parenting methods that tend to work compared to when kids are little. And so, and within the narrative field, there are some folks who talk about it as parenting to protect, where when they're little, like elementary school age, you're really protecting them. Parents are making all the safety calls and decisions, where in parenting to prepare, which increases as they get into their teen years, is preparing them to make good decisions and keep themselves safe without your help. So, looking at whether the parenting is right, or just where a person is developmentally and as an individual, whether the parent is launching, or whether it's a parent with school age, or new parents, right? That's a whole other phase of life. So looking at those developmental stages, both individual, family, relational, looking at cultural meta framework. So this is looking at in terms of how ethno-racial identity, gender identity, sexual orientation, social class, religion, immigration status, language, all those different aspects of our humanity, our social location and diversity, looking at how those might be playing out in the as a constraint or a resource for the particular interaction pattern. Then looking at just the mind or mental framework. So this is looking at patterns of cognition, emotion, intentionality. So what was the person intending to do harm or not do harm? What kind of emotions are coming up for people in this cycle? What kind of cognitions are coming up for people in this cycle? Kind of continuing, there are gender meta frameworks. So we're looking at gender-based power and role. This comes up a lot in family dynamics, especially when you layer on like immigration, cultural, ethno-racial identities, and you can have gender kind of layers on top of that, especially in a couple family relationships. And these, of course, can happen both within individual and across couple, family, and social relationships. So looking at how the gender roles are playing out. Biological meta framework. So this is looking at the medical and neurological factors that can be impacting the problems. And then spiritual framework. So looking at how faith, religion, and other existential concerns layer on to this. And I think today, even, in that category, you can put even just climate change and that whole, where are we as humanity as a species, right? There's a lot there that to be considering. And so think broadly, not just religion for spirituality, but there's a lot of layers, I think, in today's world as to what would fall under that framework. And then finally, in terms of interventions, so all of your interventions are going to be targeting the different areas of human experience. So there are obviously, sometimes your interventions are going to be your solution sequence that you're going to be proposing to the client is going to be looking at the systemic organization, right? And the sequences of behavior. So you might be really focusing on boundaries, between parents and children, or parental hierarchy, or boundaries, but with in a marriage or with a couple. Looking at layers of how culture, gender, and spirituality might be related, and there are places and ways to intervene with that. Looking sometimes biology, right? So they need a referral, they need medical intervention, they need a medical assessment to address the biology of what's going on. Looking at intergenerational patterns. So sometimes, looking at how this sequence you have in the family today fits in with the larger intergenerational patterns across generations and what that means today. So I guess you could look at my grieving Greek families, right? Organization of mind. So just the internal representations in terms of the mood, the thoughts, those sorts of things. And then finally, the development of self. So one of the things they look at is also kind of coming at a more, psychodynamic, looking at the narcissistic vulnerabilities. So, how is their self, when there is like conflict, is part of the self very kind of vulnerable, has those narcissistic vulnerabilities, or they're disowned or dissociated parts. And to see if these parts kind of come up during when a person feels threatened, you kind of access this more disowned part of the self. So the interventions can involve any and all and any combination of these things. And again, it's a very simple process. Define the problem, identify that sequence, look at where you need to, what can be changed in that sequence, considering all these different layers and meta frameworks, what might be the most useful thing, see how that goes. Did it work? Did it help? Did it not? And you just keep repeating that, right, until the problem's no longer a problem. Okay, so that is IST in a nutshell. And hopefully you can see how it is, especially if you're familiar with the older approaches in systemic therapy. I think you might go, oh my God, this is sort of makes sense, pretty straightforward. You'll also see that this layers on especially strategic MRI, systemic, and the Milan systemic approaches, all are also systemic approaches, but this is really very much the heart. And some of those approaches, they do more behavioral interventions like the directives of in strategic and MRI, where the Milan use a lot more cognitive verbal ones, I would say, and reframe positive connotation and those sorts of things. But they're all looking at that systemic interaction pattern and trying to influence it in one way or another. And I think you'll see that essence of IST, the hypothesis, and then getting feedback about that, seeing what happens, revising your hypothesis and trying something else. And that back and forth infinity pattern really describes a lot of what we do across all different approaches, right? Our clients come in, we define the problem, we try to figure out what's going on, and we have a hypothesis of what it is. We build an intervention around that. We send them home. We see if it makes a difference. We get that feedback. And we adjust our hypothesis, come up with a different, tweak that intervention, send them home again, get that feedback, fine tune it again. And that's very much a lot of what we do. And so I think sometimes just even keeping that in mind, that it's usually not this linear progression like this. There's a lot of more experimentation, especially when you get into couple and family work. I would say it's less predictable. I think that's very fair to say than individual work. Not that any human is 100% predictable by any means, but I think getting out of this expectation that there should be this perfectly linear, improvement of symptoms is often not how it goes. And so I think using this kind of essence, this hypothesizing, getting feedback, refine the hypothesis, come up with a different, tweak that plan, make sure the clients are on board, see how it works, and then is a very good way to think about this. And of course, the meta frameworks in this approach, I think, are helpful no matter which approach you're working for, to always be filtering through the many different layers of what might be influencing our client's experience of the problem, as well as what might be helpful in identifying solutions. Okay, so I hope this was a useful introduction to IST. And if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat, or once this is, I guess, up on YouTube, you can put it in the section below. But I hope this was useful in kind of wrapping your head around this approach and around systemic approaches more generally. I think it really makes it easier and more accessible to understand some of the more complex ideas that underpin family systemic therapy. So awesome. So yeah, this will be up on YouTube within the week. And so certainly it will this entire video will live on YouTube. Actually, if you go back in, you can probably find the live stream, which is because it's streaming right now. So as soon as I'm done here, there should be a live stream somewhere on YouTube if you know how to use YouTube better than I do. Awesome. Okay. Well, I am glad everyone seems to say thank you. I'm glad it kind of resonated with you, and it sounds like it made enough sense that that people are feeling like they got the information they needed. So excellent. Awesome. Okay, well, so glad this was a nice introduction. I am so thankful to the folks who've developed and are continuing to develop this approach. I think it's really going to be very welcomed by many graduate students for years to come in all areas of mental health. Okay. Oh, I do have one more question coming in. So IST views presenting problems as symptoms. Well, and I'm using symptoms very, very broadly here. I don't know if they view problems as symptoms. I think I'd have to go look it up to see exactly how they would define, but the presenting problem is what the family is saying is not working, but they'll get a definition of what's not working with the family. And there's a definition, but the most important thing is that interaction cycle, right? And sometimes that interaction cycle is going to line up with a diagnostic symptom, and sometimes it's just conflict or just behaviors that are unsatisfactory, or not healthy for their, I don't know if they'd use the word healthy. I retract that statement, but their behaviors and interaction pattern that is not feeling good in the relationship. So how do you go about with a client who's aerophobic? Well, so the problem is not the diagnosis, okay? And I always say that diagnosis, the DSM is really written by and for psychiatrists. And it's the symptom at its worst, that worst part of the cycle, is very helpful for psychiatrists. But I can tell you this, because I do a lot of DSM training, that as a mental health, a psychotherapist, professional clinical counselor, clinical social worker, those of us who are doing quote unquote psychotherapy and counseling, yes, we do diagnosis, correct. And that helps us identify what treatments might be appropriate or not, referrals to make and all that good stuff. But when you want to create change, you need to focus on that symptom cycle. And so the problem, that symptom cycle is truly the key. And so, yes, they may be aerophobic or agoraphobic or whatever that might be, but each aerophobic or agoraphobic person has their own symptom cycle that is unique to them, their problem cycle, or there's a sequence around those symptoms, right? Even if it's the same diagnosis, they all have a different sequence of what happens, how it escalates and how that whole thing goes. Our job, if you're a mental health, psychotherapist, family therapist, clinical counselors, clinical social worker, we're trying to change that dynamic. So that cycle is really what we are focused on. It's more than just reducing symptoms. Like when I work with clients, my eye is on that cycle, how they respond to triggers, quote unquote, famous, everyone's favorite word these days, it seems, how a client responds to a quote unquote trigger that would normally trigger this cycle is what I want to see change. And so that's really what you're tracking. So I hope that makes sense, Christina. And so that's kind of, the symptoms are part of the cycle, but the real focus of what you're trying to change is that sequence of behaviors. Okay. Awesome. Awesome. Okay. Hoa, I'm seeing a question here. I have a question about the overlap of dialogue in each of these meta frameworks. Is dialogue embedded in them, or is it inherent to the therapist-client relationship? So I think, what the meta frameworks are inviting the clinician to do is to filter the client situation through all of these different levels, gender, biology, spirituality, ethno-racial identity, other social, factors, social, those sorts of things, the family structure, the individual development. It's like run the situation as what the meta frameworks does for you as a clinician is it reminds you to run through all of the major facets of being human and the human experience, I think they frame it as, that could be affecting this cycle, both as a constraint and possibly as a resource. So you're always thinking through all of these. And with certain clients, you're going to talk about one of more than another. I have one client who experienced horrific, childhood abuse, and in her particular system, the sexism was really off the charts. Actually, I have a couple families like that. And so we end up talking a lot about gender because that's, part of the intergenerational, patterns that are going on. So it's really helpful to talk about that, to help us to filter through her experience today, through what she learned about her value as a person, as a child, based on her gender and what she saw role model for her all around her. So each client, each one of these meta frameworks be more important than the other. You might have a client who's got some biological, neurological things going on, and that's a major. So these meta frameworks, like I said, all of us can use them, and they're just reminders we should always be filtering through these various lenses, because with different clients, different different frameworks are more important and need to be emphasized. Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope this was, yeah, thank you. Thank you. I hope this is enlightening and helps you just kind of think more clearly about systemic approaches and just doing clinical work in general, whether it's, traditional counseling or other forms of therapy. I think there's a lot of wisdom and useful frameworks in this approach. So thank you all so much. And I look forward to seeing you soon at another live training. Take care and be well.